Thank you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I am grateful to you for your warm welcome. And Dr. Francisco Ayala, thank you very much for your very generous introduction and also for your outstanding service on the PCAST, advising the President. We're grateful to you and your colleagues. To the President of the AAAS, Dr. Rita Colwell, and the incoming President, Dr. Jane Lubchenco, and to all of the officers and distinguished guests who are present, let me single out some very distinguished colleagues of mine in public service. Senator Paul Sarbanes, who has been acknowledged previously, and Mayor Kurt Schmoke, the head of the State Senate here, Mike Miller, and I believe Governor Paris Glendening had to depart for the State House, but I want to acknowledge all of them as a group. And to all of the distinguished guests present, thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak here today. I appreciate you braving the cold weather. It's been so cold recently that those who don't know me well have thought I was frozen stiff. That's all right, I'm used to that reaction. I've heard most of those stiff jokes by now. Every time I hear a new one, I always have the same reaction. Very funny, Tipper. But I do enjoy being Vice President very much. In fact, I went on the David Letterman show not too long ago and was asked to give a list of the top 10 best things about being Vice President. I won't go through that list here today, but I'm reminded by this podium here of number 5 on the list of best things about being Vice President. It has to do with the Great Seal of the Vice President. If you close your left eye and turn your head just right, it says, President of the United States of America. You can experiment and validate that result for yourselves. Over the next 3 days, I will be delivering 3 speeches on America's science and technology challenges. Tomorrow in Virginia, I will ask how must we update our notions of self-government to bring them into harmony with the new discoveries and new capacities of the information age. On Wednesday, in Philadelphia, I will celebrate the 50th anniversary of the ENIAC computer, the first programmable computer, and ask, are we providing the necessary spark to ignite private innovation, new industries, and better jobs? But today, before this extraordinary collection of minds gathered here in Baltimore, I want to ask the question that in many ways must precede the others. What is the role of science in American society? Why does science matter anyway? These are, of course, complex and broad questions, and no one person has all the answers, and I certainly don't. And in fact, before I proceed any further, I would like to recalibrate your expectations in case they need it. As you listen during the next half hour, think of our session as being similar to a biology class, but don't think of me in the role of the professor, rather in the role of the frog. So as you prepare to pick apart what I have to say here, let me begin by describing a deep but little noticed change in the pond of our public life. Not too long ago, when the debates here in Baltimore raged on about the design of our self-government, the metaphors originating in science migrated easily and frequently into the realm of political and economic affairs. In previous generations, the logic and lingo of science, from Newtonian physics to the industrial science of Frederick Taylor, informed our public conversation and enriched our shared understanding of the phenomena of our lives. But not today, or at least not in the same way. During the early decades of the scientific revolution, many of those who participated in discussions about the great discoveries of that age themselves migrated from the world of science back and forth into culture, politics, economics, business, and the rest. Today, if you look objectively at the sheer number of new discoveries that illuminate our understanding of the physical world around us, the discoveries each decade, each year, each month overwhelm the number of discoveries in any comparable period of time during the early years of the scientific revolution. And yet, the number of these new explanations which migrate in the form of metaphors into the broader culture seems to have declined, perhaps even in real numbers, but certainly on a relative basis. As a result, the language we use to discuss public problems is less vivid and less robust than it ought to be. Chaos theory might offer clues for when government should intervene in the economy. Economic policy might focus less on priming the pump, an old metaphor, and more on imprinting the DNA. But it's very difficult to strike up a conversation about the multitude of new explanations coming out of science today, even though, as I've said, some of them have surprising explanatory power. Ilya Prigogine, 2 decades ago, described how a closed system, when forced to contain a sharp increase in the amount of energy flowing into it and through it and out the other side, an open system rather, will break down and spontaneously reorganize itself at a higher degree of complexity. We see in our social structures a similar phenomena going on right before our eyes, with the world's population increasing by 1 billion people every decade, with the amount of real energy in society increasing at a logarithmic rate. Older, reliable, well-known, trusted structures seem themselves to break down and then spontaneously reorganize themselves at a higher degree of complexity. What are we missing by not describing these phenomena in the language and metaphors of science? We either avoid scientific metaphors altogether, or we lean against the crutch of industrial age metaphors, the clock, the machine, metaphors that are splintering with age. In particular, we continue to rely on the metaphor of the factory, of mechanized mass production, well after it has exhausted much of its supporting force. Today, in the spirit of academic inquiry, I'd like to propose an alternative metaphor, one more appropriate to the times and more muscular in its power to explain. It has been said by others that our society is shifting from the organizing metaphor of the machine to the metaphor of the computer. I think it's a computer of a particular kind, and specifically, I'm attracted to the metaphor of distributed intelligence. In the beginning of the computer era, when ENIAC was created, and for several decades after that, computers relied almost completely on huge central processing units surrounded by large fields of memory. And each time a task had to be performed, the CPU would send out to the field of memory to retrieve the raw information it needed to solve the problem, bring it back to the center, perform the calculation that was needed, and then distribute the answer back into the field of memory. Some clever computer scientists improved on this model with an approach called vector processing. IBM first got its competitive advantage by starting the second trip out to the field of memory while the first was still underway, but each of the bits of data retrieved had to still be stacked up to await processing by the CPU. Then along came a new architecture called massive parallelism. This broke up the processing power of the central processing unit and distributed this intelligence throughout the field of memory, so that wherever memory was stored, there in close proximity was placed a much smaller, weaker, but ubiquitous information processor. When a problem was presented, all of the processors would begin working simultaneously, each performing its small part of the task, and each sending its portion of the answer to the center to be collated with the rest of the work that was going on. Experience seems to demonstrate that for the majority of problems, this approach is more effective. Instead of requiring 3 trips to and from the CPU, only 1 trip is required. Less heat is generated, more power can be contained in a smaller space, less time is required for the processing. But more complicated software is necessary, and that has been the limiting factor. This idea of distributed intelligence, as revolutionary as it was in the computer world, never traveled to other regions of our life, and certainly didn't come anywhere near politics. But I think that in spite of that, the basic principles illustrated by distributed intelligence can be seen throughout our society. What was the victory of representative democracy over monarchy or dictatorship, if not a demonstration of the advantages of distributed intelligence in the political sphere? Here in the United States, in our revolution and in our Constitution, we asserted the revolutionary idea that the average citizen is better able to understand the information that is yielded by the circumstances of his or her life and make decisions accordingly than any ruler in a central location sending out to the hinterlands for information upon which to make a decision. And the cumulative result of the distributed intelligence embodied in democracy turns out to be far superior to the decisions made by a dictatorship. Similarly, what is the victory of capitalism over a command economy, if not a clear demonstration of the power of the marketplace in billions of small transactions quantifying supply and demand, when collated, guiding the economy much more wisely than some central planner attempting to keep up with consumer preferences, backlogs, surpluses, shortages, shifting production capacity, new innovations. It's impossible. The Soviet Union and communism generally collapsed economically as economic activity accelerated, and it became impossible for a central decision maker to keep up. This same principle illuminates the reason why private sector organizations are shedding their layers of middle management and pushing power, information, and influence to frontline employees. The person on the old assembly line or behind the desk interacting with the public or working on the word processor is better able to understand the kinds of changes that are needed within that particular organization than some so-called expert at the apex of the management pyramid relying on reports to work their way steadily up through the layers of management to his or her desk. I saw a report recently on a group of investors who style themselves as the Motley Fool and exist on the internet. They base their approach on the principle that the individual consumer who notices that a particular brand of coffee tastes good may be better able to judge the relative value of the stocks offered by coffee companies than an investment advisor on Wall Street. If that individual consumer is linked to others who can also notice in their sphere of experience whether or not there's a shortage in the store or whether or not the pricing is competitive. And by linking through the internet 100,000 different small investors, this particular group claims and has been credited with a performance for their predictions about particular stocks that far outstrips the major established brokerage houses. Well, all of this may raise a question much like the one that Lily Tomlin asked last week when President Clinton signed the new landmark legislation reforming American telecommunications law. As I was interacting with her during the signing ceremony over the internet, her character, Ernestine the operator, asked me, "Well, Mr. Smarty Pants, if you know so much, how come you're not signing the bill?" And to rephrase it, in other words, if this is such a great metaphor, how come it hasn't taken hold? Here's one possible explanation. I've got it wrong. Perhaps the metaphor of distributed intelligence simply isn't as powerful as I believe it is. Here's another possibility. The increasing segmentation of society, in particular the segmentation of scientific disciplines. At their best, the scientific community and the university community embody the ideal of distributed intelligence. The great power of science derives in part from specialization into disciplines. But much of the power also comes from open criticism and communication across disciplines. Indeed, some of the most significant discoveries have emerged from the productive friction that occurs when different perspectives rub against each other and produce the spark of new insight. But if the physicists don't talk to the chemists, and the chemists don't talk to the economists, and the economists don't talk to the climatologists, then distributed intelligence is more aspiration than reality. Look at the resistance Lynn Margulies faced for her astonishing discoveries about the evolution of cells. Because the basic principles she explored crossed so many different disciplines, those critics who insisted upon evaluating her insights within the narrow confines of a single discipline held out long after they should have and resisted the insight that she was providing. If it is true within science, how much more of a problem is it at the boundary between science and the rest of society? There's a third possibility why the notion of distributed intelligence has not migrated into our public conversation, and that is the growing disconnect between science and democracy. Walk through the halls of Congress and you will see the Gucci loafers of corporate lobbyists, but not the white lab coats of American scientists. Page through a directory of members of Congress and you will find over 150 lawyers, but only 6 scientists, 2 engineers, and 1 science teacher among the 535 people in the House and Senate. As a result, scientific concepts sometimes are missing from our public discourse. And that is, in my view, unfortunate. But let me dwell a moment on some of the harder-edged consequences in the hopes that it will solidify my case for this new metaphor. Lack of scientific understanding undercuts support for the pursuit of further understanding, which fosters deeper ignorance, which in turn further erodes support for efforts to battle that ignorance. It's a vicious cycle, and it's well underway. Listen to what some members of Congress have been saying recently. 2 weeks after the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded to Sherry Rowland and Mario Molina, who are here in the front row, I didn't know you two were going to be here when I wrote this, but I'm glad you are. 2 weeks after the two of them were awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for their work on ozone depletion, the chairman of the Republican caucus in the House of Representatives, Texas Congressman Tom DeLay, said, and I'm quoting, "The science underlying the CFC ban is debatable and the result of a media scare." The same gentleman also said that we made a terrible mistake as a society to ban DDT because it is not harmful in his considered view. Another of his colleagues recently said that climate change is just, quote, liberal claptrap. And just a few weeks ago, there was a hearing on clean drinking water, looking at problems such as the cryptosporidium outbreak in Milwaukee, which killed 100 people 2 years ago. An Oklahoma congressman said, and I'm quoting once again to assure you that I'm not making this up, "I want to touch on cryptosporidium for a minute. This disease can sometimes be very helpful because it helps us identify those who, in fact, are immune compromised." Well, when you think about it, there are all sorts of diagnostic tools that could be used. These comments ought to send shivers up our spines because they suggest that the lack of scientific language and metaphors is merely the symptom of a deeper disregard for science itself, a taste for junk science, a belief that science is just another rhetorical tool to be manipulated and twisted in order to fit a preconceived ideological view. It's further proof of the vicious cycle I mentioned a few moments ago, and that's precisely the opposite of how it should work in America. For much of this century, Americans have benefited from a virtuous cycle, a virtuous circle of science and success. As the nation generated wealth, a portion of that wealth was invested in research, science, and technology. Those investments helped answer what seemed answerable, and eventually spawned still greater wealth, which was then invested in still more research. On and on it went. In this virtuous circle, launched with bipartisan agreement and support, prosperity generated investment, investment generated answers, and answers generated further prosperity. But now, because of the woeful lack of knowledge, some evidence of which I've just presented, that virtuous circle risks coming undone. At the very moment a new age demands continued investments in science and technology, there are some in Congress threatening to turn the clock backward with the largest cuts in 15 years. In their most recent budget, according to the AAAS's own study, the congressional leadership proposed reducing federal funding for science and technology by 1/3 by the year 2002, adjusted for inflation. And several years after the Cold War has ended, they propose that defense R&D go up while civilian R&D goes sharply down. More for Star Wars, less for environmental research. At the very moment global economic competition and global environmental degradation demand civilian research and the technologies it often produces, this Congress is proposing the sharpest cuts in non-defense research since America was in the midst of fighting World War II. On question after question, they say, we don't know enough to act, and we don't want to know. The latter statement being implicit in their sharp cuts in the research necessary to improve our understanding of the most serious challenges that we face. This organization's study a few months ago laid out the numbers plain and simple. The only investment that Congress wants to increase was in health sciences, and that's great, and it's understandable. All of us who have had family members stricken by a disease that has not yet yielded to the search for a cure understand why this ought to be increased. But in almost every other realm, they are approaching science with the wisdom of a potted plant. Research on issues and again, part of the reason is while it's easy for all of us to understand the need for more health research, it ought to be easier for all of us in public life to understand the urgency of the questions that are being pursued in other realms of science. research on issues that will affect the health of our children, the condition of our planet, the vibrancy of our economy. All of these research tasks risk being slashed to the bone. Global climate change, down. Supercomputers, down. Nuclear nonproliferation, down. New materials, way down. Solar energy, way down. Environmental satellites, down. Water quality, down. Everything that ought to be up is down with this Congress, and everything that ought to be open is closed. Their science policy is straight out of science fiction. A few of them speak impressively like Johnny Mnemonic, but most support policies designed for Fred Flintstone. They propose to go boldly where no Congress has gone before, but their flight plan will take us into the ground. President Clinton vetoed several of the bills containing these cuts, but not before the other side shut down the government and furloughed thousands of government scientists. And right now, several agencies, in particular the National Science Foundation, are sputtering along with stopgap funding that makes it almost impossible to plan and difficult even to finance day-to-day activities. But the saddest part is that it doesn't have to be this way. Last week, President Clinton proposed a budget outline that leads to the first balanced budget in 17 years, and he gets there without compromising our values, without abandoning our commitments to education, the environment, and science and technology. Of course, we have got to balance the budget, but there is both a sensible path and a dangerous path that can take us there. President Clinton has offered a better way. On education, he's made real progress, launching direct student loans, opening the doors of college to more Americans, establishing education standards so every diploma will mean something, promoting educational technology in the classroom, proposing a plan to link every classroom and every library in America to the information superhighway by the year 2000, proposing a tax deduction for families' investments in higher education. And on science and technology, he has also scored big, in large part because he's fielded such a strong scientific team. Jack Gibbons has become the most influential science advisor the White House has seen in a generation. Cabinet secretaries like Bruce Babbitt, Ron Brown, Carol Browner, Hazel O'Leary, and Donna Shalala have fought for a cleaner environment, a strong technology base, national laboratories, and healthcare research. Dan Golden has helped take NASA to the stars while keeping the costs here on Earth. And every layer of the administration is peopled with women and men dedicated to discovery. And that team has delivered results. We've extended the R&D tax credit for 3 years, lowered capital gains taxes for investments in emerging companies, scaled back the antitrust barriers to joint ventures in research, beefed up protection of intellectual property, giving inventors real protections for their patents, boosted funding for the nation's flagship research agencies, launched an educational technology initiative, established the National Science and Technology Council, supported enhanced research into global environmental problems such as climate change, and ensured our environmental regulations meet the test of common sense and cutting-edge science. But we cannot do it alone, and that is not how democracies work. And that is where you come in. Democracies depend on distributed intelligence, and this democracy needs the sound of your voices and the dedication of your hearts. You must take up the call for knowledge. You must enlist in the army of persuasion, whose battle cry says that knowledge is important for knowledge's own sake. Because when you say something is important and say it with enough force, others just may pay attention. But if you view your own pursuit of knowledge as divorced from the nation's pursuit of progress, both endeavors will fall short of their goals. In a sense, at this edge of a new century, we have a choice between two paths. One retreats from understanding, flinches in the face of challenges, and disdains research and learning. It's a know-nothing society in which the storehouses of knowledge fall into disrepair, the spigots of discovery are twisted off, and missions of exploration are stalled on the ground. This know-nothing society would base regulations on suspicion instead of science. It says DDT isn't harmful, claims global warming is the empirical equivalent of the Easter Bunny, is a direct descendant of the society that insisted the earth was flat. That is the path, however, we will be forced onto if deep cuts in research and development and science and technology become the blueprint for our future. In these congressional mandates scattered throughout their proposals are not only cuts in funding, but also outright prohibitions on particular kinds of research. The guiding principle is an old saying applied to a modern nation: what we don't know won't hurt us. The trouble is, that's the recipe for destruction in a distributed intelligence society. But there is a second path, infinitely brighter, considerably more American. It's a path on which government continues funding basic science and applied technology. It's a path that keeps the virtuous circle of progress and prosperity alive and functioning. It is a path whose signposts say education is a matter of national security. Environmental protection is a matter of national security. It's a path dotted with investments that open the doors of education to all of our people. A path that applies what we have learned from science to the other parts of our lives. It's a trail that is within our power to blaze. We have in our hands and our minds and our souls the power to create this learning society. That is partly what this year's presidential elections are all about. In closing, last year, another president, Chuck Vest, the president of MIT, decided to present his annual report as a series of questions his faculty told him were the most urgent ones in their respective fields. What he told us in that report underscores the need to deliver on these crucial investments in science and technology. He reminded us that we don't know which aspects of climate change are predictable, and we need to know. We don't know how best to use our information infrastructure and new media to promote learning among children, and we need to know. We don't know how to produce materials with no waste byproducts, and we need to know. We don't know how to extract all the energy from existing fuel sources, and we need to know. We don't know how old is the universe, what is it made of, and what will its fate be. We do not understand what mechanism generates mass in the building blocks of matter. No. We don't know how best to use our information infrastructure and new media to promote learning among children, and we need to know. We don't know how to produce materials with no waste byproducts, and we need to know. We don't know how to extract all the energy from existing fuel sources, and we need to know. We don't know how old is the universe, what is it made of, and what will its fate be. We do not understand what mechanism generates mass in the building blocks of matter, and we need to know. We need to know all these things. We need to understand these things. We need to discover these things. We need to create a learning society, a society that harnesses the power of distributed intelligence and uses it to lift up our lives. And as the very embodiment of that ideal, you have an obligation, I argue here, to help make it happen. As always in America, it is possible. As the President said, we live in the age of possibilities. But it is up to us. As always in America, it is possible because it's up to us. Let's get to work. Thank you very much. Thank you.